Welcome back to Washington Watch. Joseph Backholm sitting in for Tony. Glad that you are with us today. The conversation this week and today quickly turned from Afghanistan to Texas heartbeat bill. It may be something of a gift to President Biden because the subject has been changed from all of the things he has not done particularly well and put him in a place where he can once again defend abortion rights, which I think he likes politically, but of course we don't like it for all sorts of other reasons, I should say. Continuing our discussion on the good news from Texas about their pro-life bill, my colleague David Closson, FRC's director of the Center for Biblical Worldview, is here to unpack the biblical mandates and teaching on the issue of abortion. David, good to have you with us again.
Oh, good to be with you, Joseph.
So lots of chatter about abortion. Why don't we start at the beginning of this thing and remind people why Christians care about the issue of abortion?
Yeah, great question, Joseph. And so far, it's been a great show, kind of looking at the policy implications, some of the political realities, some of the legal reasoning behind the Supreme Court's decision. But first and foremost, the debate about life, the debate about the personhood of the unborn, the whole abortion question, this is first and foremost a theological question. And there's a reason that Christians have cared about this issue since the first century. And simply put, those of us who follow Jesus, who believe in the authority of Scripture, we're against abortion because we believe that abortion, the intentional killing of a human being, is an assault on God. It's an assault on those who are made in His image. And it's just, fascinating that there are those who claim to be Christians, who claim to follow Jesus, and are up in arms about the Supreme Court's decision to allow this Texas law to take in place. But if you look at what the Scripture teaches, if you look at what the church has taught for 2,000 years, every Christian in this country should be thrilled that there are more, it is safer to be a baby right now in Texas because of the Supreme Court's decision.
That's exactly right. And very practically, this time next year, right? We're in September. This time next year, there are going to be little people on the planet who otherwise would have been killed. There's going to be thousands of them probably. And that is good news. It's unambiguously good news. And as we were talking about earlier in the program, we're going to find that it's not the catastrophe that it is spun as, and that these babies are really going to be a blessing to the lives of the people that they touch. And so we know that the reality and the experience is going to bear out what Scripture tells us, which is that children are a blessing from the Lord, and they reflect Him. And of course, we as parents learn a lot, and we get stretched by having children, but all of that is ultimately good. But David, from a worldview perspective, if we care about individuals, and we do, why shouldn't we defend the individual rights of a woman as an individual to determine what happens with her body? Why is that not the biblical answer to this question?
Yeah, so it's not the biblical, the way, that's not even the right way to frame the question. Of course, as Christians, we believe that all people are made in God's image and therefore have inherent value and inherent dignity. That's where, as Christians, we ground the whole discussion about human rights. In worldview discussion, other worldviews really don't even have a grounding for human rights. Those of us who are Christians who follow Jesus do, because we believe everyone is made in God's image. When we're talking about the issue of abortion, we need to realize we're talking about two image bearers. We're talking about the mother, yes, but we're also talking about her unborn child who is made in God's image. And Joseph, I think this is a great opportunity. Whenever abortion's in the news, whatever it might be, I remember in the last presidential election, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who now serves as the Secretary of Transportation, when he was running for president, he made comments along the lines of, as someone who is a faithful Christian who reads the Bible, who has a high view of Scripture, I read Scripture and it teaches that life begins with breath, therefore I'm pro-choice. That gave us an opportunity to talk about what the Bible actually teaches on this issue. This news out of Texas gives us another opportunity. And I just want to make sure, a lot of Christians are following this news and, might have an idea that the Bible maybe addresses this issue somehow. A lot of people have heard of Psalm 136, where it says that we're fearfully and wonderfully made. But there are other texts throughout the Bible, in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, in Luke chapter 1, that affirms the personhood of the unborn. And the church has understood this for 2,000 years. So I just think it's important whenever abortion's in the news, especially for Christians. Joseph, you and I know that only 20% of those who attend church actually have a biblical worldview. So it's important for us, whenever this issue comes up in the news, to affirm the church has taught with one voice, Catholic, Orthodox, every branch of Protestantism for 2,000 years, that has a high view of Scripture, that the Bible indeed affirms the personhood of the unborn, and that's grounded in that doctrine of the Imago Dei.
That's well said. And you mentioned Pete Buttigieg and his ability to bring in kind of these theological questions. And it's interesting how Pete Buttigieg basically leads with his faith when he tries to make these arguments that are really in significant ways inconsistent with Scripture.
Yes.
And he's certainly not the only one. And there's really this instinct from people on the left politically who really want to kind of claim the mantle of God and pull God over to their side of this issue. And we saw that this week with Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And I'm going to play that and lead this into this part of this conversation. Let's go ahead and let that play.
When we go back to Washington, we will be putting Roe v. Wade codification on the floor of the House to make sure that women everywhere have access to the reproductive health that they need. I say that as a mother of 5 children, and I respect everyone's decisions, their personal decisions, but that's why we have to give them the ability to make those decisions.
Nancy Pelosi is also very publicly Catholic, as of course is President Biden. They claim to be Catholic. And she always, it's curious, every time she talks about how important it is to be able to have an abortion, she talks about her 5 children. And there's not a small amount of irony in that to me, as I realize these are children. I think children are great, but you should be able to kill your children if you find them to be inconvenient to you in some way. Where do you think that instinct comes from for people to claim their religion while defending abortion, to claim a religion that ultimately they don't follow in significant ways?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joseph. You know, a poll that we did earlier this summer at FRC, we're surveying Americans on what they believe, what their worldview is. You know, we know that only 6% of Americans have a biblical worldview, but what the polling showed was that 51% of Americans think they have a biblical worldview. So for at least the majority of Americans, language of faith and the Bible and Christianity is still appealing. People, whether they want to escape, you can't escape that people like to make moral and theological arguments. And for Nancy Pelosi, the arguments that she's making is the same arguments that Joe Biden has made as a candidate and now as president, that he is a faithful, practicing Catholic, but he disagrees with the church's teaching on abortion. And there's just something fundamentally incompatible about that. You know, the Catholic Church, let's be clear, Pope Francis, a lot of people give this Pope grief for positions that he's taken or some ambiguous things that he said on different issues. This Pope has been very clear that the Catholic Church has not moved an inch when it comes to the sanctity of human life, the personhood of the unborn. As I think when you hear a statement like what Speaker Pelosi is making, you just, at least when I hear it, it's just very clear that there's just an absolute disconnect between what she claims to be her faith and then the public policy that she pursues and pursues with a vengeance.
It's a good point. It reminds me of a Tim Keller quote. It's something like, he said, if your God never disagrees with you, you might be worshiping an idealized version of yourself. And that, of course, is a bipartisan critique of just humanity and whatever your particular religious perspective is. If you've never found yourself in a moment where you were like, man, this is what I want to believe, this is what I think, but it looks like maybe God thinks something different, so I might need to adjust what I think. Do you think that's what's happening in this case and other cases?
Well, I think so, Joseph. A conversation you and I had a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about, the vast majority of people believe that humanity is fundamentally good. We don't understand basic theological concepts such as original sin. But I think you're right. People, we know from polling that 88% of Americans have what you could call a synchronistic worldview. So they pick and choose parts of different worldviews and systems of thought and beliefs, and they kind of put it together. And it doesn't really matter that it's kind of inconsistent, it's logically incoherent, but that's how 88% of our friends and neighbors in this country operate. This is how they live their lives. And so even those who claim to belong to a religion that has a high view of human life, they really are drawn towards this radical autonomy, this, I can pick my own worldview. And I think that's what you see specifically with these pro-choice, so-called pro-choice Catholics or pro-choice evangelicals, is that they might want to claim parts of the Christian worldview, but they're actually operating from a more naturalistic, postmodern worldview when it comes to a really fundamental issue like the human being and the personhood of the unborn.
The reaction we've seen from many on the left to this Texas heartbeat bill, I think, is a function in part of how important abortion is to them. Now, in the past, anecdotally in conversations, I basically said, okay, if you want to give citizen status to everyone who's here illegally, fine. You've just got to come with me on abortion. Or you can set whatever marginal tax rate you want to set for the billionaires. I'll go along with that. You just got to give me abortion. And whatever the issue is, they say no. And it appears to me, and I haven't studied this empirically, but it appears to me that's the hill that they will die on, that they would defend that issue hardest. Why do you think that is?
No, you're absolutely right, Joseph. And I think I said it earlier, people are inescapably moral and theological in the way we think about these issues. And absolutely, as far as the left goes, the political left in this country, their new sacrament, so to speak, is abortion. And it's tragic that they're willing to sacrifice on the altar of their own political goals children, unborn babies who are made in the image of God. But it's absolutely true. On the left now, you have a sacrament of abortion, and it just seems, and this is so clear by the response all over the country to the decision of the Supreme Court to allow this Texas law to go into effect. And you have people just absolutely outraged and in a tizzy. And I think it's because this is so central to their worldview, so central to their own autonomy. And I think that that's exactly what's going on right now.
I think sacrament is actually the right word to use there, which leads me to another thought, because they are now being told that they cannot take this sacrament in Texas, so to speak. And you see how outraged they are, which leads us to another issue that we've been dealing with for other people who like to take sacraments, people like Christians who like to take other sacraments and go to churches. I think we're seeing, based on the reaction of the left, that maybe, do you think they're going to have some sympathy for Christians who objected to being told you're not allowed to go to church?
I don't think that's coming anytime soon, Joseph, but you're right. I know you had an op-ed that came out today in Town Hall that's just showing recently that a lot of Christian churches who were shut down by governors and mayors, mostly in blue cities and states, it turns out that these politicians definitely overstepped their boundaries and went out from what the law actually allowed them to do, even during a pandemic.
Some of those stories, because we actually had some good news out of that. Tell us what happened for John MacArthur and Grace Community Church.
Yeah, that's just the latest example. Grace Community Church in California, their pastor John MacArthur, well-known evangelical pastor, they were just awarded $800,000 from the county and from the city. Because if people followed this story, a Grace Community Church, like churches all over this country, it's interesting, Joseph. I know we don't have time to go through the whole backstory, but when the COVID-19 pandemic first broke out, it was 99% of churches ceased in-person Bible studies, meetings, followed the advice that health departments were giving, and said, let's see what happens. But then a couple months into the pandemic, when abortion clinics, liquor stores, marijuana dispensaries were allowed to reopen, and
Speaking of sacraments,
that's right. But then you had mayors and governors allowing those things to open and casinos to open, but then saying churches still had to remain closed. You had a lot of churches that said, wait a second, that doesn't seem to be fair. This seems to be Caesar over exerting what he's allowed to do in the realm of politics, but as well violating First Amendment rights. So you had churches beginning to open up, and then you had jurisdictions like LA County going after these churches. And it turns out a year and a half later that these mayors and governors are now settling with these churches, realizing that they definitely overextended and went past what they were actually legally allowed to do.
All right. And the reason that's important is because Grace Bible Church and many of these other churches that decided to start meeting again relatively early in the process received a lot of criticism from other Christians who told them, no, you shouldn't do that. You need to submit to the governing authority, and you need to do what the local politician tells you to do, right? But what these cases are clarifying for us is that it was, in fact, the politicians who were in violation of the law. It was not the churches that were in violation of the law. So the people who needed to submit to the governing authority was not the pastor of the church that was meeting. It was the mayor. It was the governor who was telling people you can't gather because the Constitution is the governing authority, and that's what needs to be obeyed, right? Do you think this is going to help the church navigate these issues in the future?
I hope so, and that's a super important point. We should never conflate obedience to politicians with obedience to the law. Because, in this country, we are called in Romans 13 to submit to the governing authorities, and ultimately, we're called to submit to the law. Now, as Christians, we know we can't go against, we have one Lord, and when the government tells us to do something that's in direct disobedience to Scripture, that's a road that Christians can't cross. And so I do hope that as Christians, we look at this, and this guides us for other situations moving forward.
David Closson, really appreciate your time, as always.
Thanks, Joseph.